Well, last night we brought you the story of Toomelah, an Indigenous community in northern New South Wales, shattered by unemployment, alcohol, drugs and violence. Some residents feel abandoned and that their children's future is under threat.
Young children, how would I put it? Below the ages of, 5 that have actually been raped. I mean, physically raped. The victims, the young kids could actually see their perpetrators coming or walking, and they start trembling and shaking and all that sort of stuff and have nightmares. That stuff continues, yeah.
So they want to talk about our sad community. They needed to listen to us back in the day when we were telling them what was working here, and they took it all away.
The former Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, Brough, was one of the architects of the Northern Territory intervention. He says governments, both state and federal, are washing their hands of responsibility to communities like Toomelah. He's now seeking pre-selection in the Queensland seat for a tilt at the next federal election. And Brough joins us now from Maroochydore on the Sunshine Coast. Welcome.
Thanks, Chris. Good to be with you.
How did you feel when you saw that story last night?
Mixed emotions. On Saturday, I think The Australian ran a similar story about a community that I know well in the APY lands, with about 50% of the children there being allegedly sexually abused. All of the allegations that your story raised again, were dealt with in 2006 when I was a minister. And, sadly, years move on. Ministers come and go, but the outcomes aren't changing. And I think that it was more despair, despondency. And I guess the other emotion, Chris, is one of anger that there hasn't been an outrage in the public today. And I mean the mainstream media, talkback radio, the blogs going off as they did when ABC ran the story last year about cattle being mistreated in Indonesia. These are Australian kids that have been mistreated, and yet we're not having the same outrage. In fact, it's almost gone without comment.
Do you think that Australians are inured to this, or do they just think that it's such a hopeless situation that there's no point in commenting on it?
I wish I had an answer. I think a lot of people are desensitised, and I think the other thing, and jaded. I also feel that I was speaking to a friend not long ago this evening, and he said, I turned it off. Sometimes these things are just too tough for us to deal with. And I think if we can strip away the fact that they're Aboriginal children and just call them children, just take away the colour, take away the race altogether, maybe we'd re-engage again as a public, and we would say, no, we can't allow this to happen. We need to show leadership as a society. We need to show leadership as politicians and political leaders and as community leaders. And if we do that, it's not beyond our wit to be able to address these issues.
But what we saw in Toomelah, as you say, it's replicated around the country. It's not in the Northern Territory or Queensland or New South Wales. It's replicated everywhere. Is this a complete failure by the political class, both state and federal?
Yes, it is. And I think that what you will get is we'll have pretty much a different game set. We'll involve Aboriginal people. We'll do more consultation. Go back to Marcus Einfeld, 1988. I think your story said that the government of the day was shocked into action or shamed into action. But we fixed the physical being. We didn't actually fix the underlying problems. And that's what's breaking society. When you have 5-year-olds that are being raped, and I mean, I guess, sadly, brings up memories for me of seeing children who had been raped by other children. And you think, how sick is a society? And yet we turn and say, well, can't they fix themselves? I think we've got to deal with the reality that these individuals are so badly broken, they're now adults, they're perpetrating similar crimes of neglect and abuse on children. They are Australian children, and it takes our political class, our human rights lawyers, our human rights activists, our young people, everybody, to say enough is enough. We must change from the ways that we've been going, because that has failed miserably. We must put them as children first and foremost, culture second, and deal with the atrocities that are happening to Australian children today.
You had a go at trying to do this, obviously, with the intervention in the Northern Territory, which is an area the Commonwealth did have control over, yet there are a lot of questions about the way that was implemented, that it was hasty and that it hasn't been as successful as you would have hoped.
No, it hasn't been as successful as I would have hoped, and it hasn't gone down, hasn't continued the way in which I had hoped to be able to run it either. So others have taken it and taken it in a direction of their own choosing. What I don't think helps here, Chris, at all, is laying blame at Liberal, Labor, state, federal, Aboriginal, white. We've all stuffed it up. We've got it wrong. And what we need to do is admit those failings and say that we dedicate ourselves to protecting Australian children. And once we do that and we set that threshold, we'll start to get somewhere. Your story last night, the nurse, 18 years a nurse, as credible as you can get, said there isn't a family in Toomelah that hasn't been touched by that abuse. That is a society almost beyond repair by just another program, another intervention. We need to look at root and cause why we have Aboriginal people living in isolation, almost on top of the rest of society, but on their own in almost what you'd call an apartheid fashion, and say, what message is that sending to those children? Why are they being so isolated? And how much better can we do this?
Well, one of the problems that they have is they're economically isolated. They can't be connected to the real economy. One of the programs that was used there was a community development employment program. And again, your government was opposed to those sorts of measures. They're removed now. There's no work at all.
See, that's just a misnomer. The pride that, you know, and understand that when people have only known one way for 3 or 4 decades, and that is 2 days a week work, 6 hours a day for some of the workers, and we talk about the pride that that can deliver. That isn't working for yourself. That is not working for anything other than the government cleaning up around your own community. What about the real jobs? We're talking about here on one of the busiest highways in this nation. This is the New England Highway. This is only about 3 hours out of Brisbane. This is not far down the road to the mining boom in New South Wales and up the road to Queensland. People are only isolated because we have isolated them. These people are not geographically isolated, they're socially isolated. And we are causing that by forcing them, if you like, if you will, to live in a place with no governance, with little law and order and virtually no self-respect or community respect. And then we expect it somehow to work. It hasn't worked for 4 or 5 decades. What I'm suggesting, Chris, is tonight, we as an Australian community, not just politicians, as an Australian community say enough is enough. We acknowledge the mistakes of the past and we don't look to blame, but we look to say, where will we go that will be better in the future? And if they were my children, how quickly would I act to try and protect them? Would it be tomorrow or would it be after a series of reports in another 12 months? And if we answer that honestly, then maybe it'll cause us to act far more rapidly than we have.
Extremely tough question to answer, though, isn't it, Brough?
Of course it is, otherwise it would have been done. And Chris, I think every minister, state and federal, Liberal and Labor, I make one exception. One exception, the man that was the Labor minister who's now in prison, that was my counterpart at the time, for crimes against children. But he's the exception. The majority of people, they want to do the right thing. But I sometimes feel that it's because of the cringe, the cultural cringe, the worry and the fear of being called a racist, that we don't deal with these people as children, Australian children. We somehow deal with them differently and we expect a different outcome. All right. And we are getting that different outcome.
Well, Brough, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris.